In this video, we're going to implement the patch method for updating the details of an existing task. The details will be provided to the server in JSON format in the request body, very much like how we submitted a request to create a task in the previous video. Okay, so we'll open Atom, and you can see here that this is our empty get, which is the /tasks root. Now in the previous video we implemented the create a task, and that was using the post. So I'm just going to sort of shrink that down because we're going to be focusing on the /tasks / then a task number because we want to provide a task ID of the one that we're going to update. So it's back in this root here, task ID. So if I just expand that, and you can see we've got our get request. We're not interested in that at the moment, so I'll fold that up. Delete also, we'll fold that up. And in one of the previous lessons we created the shell for the patch. Now this is the one that we're going to be using in this video. So what I'm going to do is just create some space here and just move it down so we can see where we're going. Now we'll create the try and catch statements to begin with. So try and then catch. The first one is a task exception, EX, and the next one, just like the previous videos, catch PDO exception, and then EX. And we'll just fill these in whilst we're on. So the task exception, we need to create the response, new response, and then we want to set the HTTP status code, and this will be a 400 error. We want to set this success, that would be false because we're dealing with the errors. And then we want to add a message, and that would be the message that's passed in from the error from creating the task. So we want EX get message, and then we want to send it, oops, and then exit. So that's a task exception done. So what I'm going to do is just copy and paste this. So the task exception has a 400 HTTP status code, but this will have a 500 error because that's a server error if it's a PDO exception, whereas a task exception, if we've passed in some data that is not valid for a task, then it's a client issue. So instead of getting the message from the exception, we'll just provide a standard message in a string. So this is updating the task, so fail to update task, check your data for errors, for example. Good error message there. We'll send that and exit that. Now with it being a PDO exception, we'll log this just like we've done previously in the error log. Database query error, and then we'll append the exception onto that and then save it in the PHP error log. Save that. Get rid of this white space. Just tidy it up a bit. Okay, so we're going to be working within this try statement here. So I'm just going to create some space. Okay, so think about this. We are sending a request, an HTTP request, using the patch method, but we are wanting to update an existing task that's in the database. So it might be to change the title or to add a description or something like that. So what we need to do first is to check the type of data that's being sent, just to make sure that it's JSON data that we're sending in the request body. So very much similar to how we checked or did the initial checks on the creation of a task. Initially we're just going to sort of run through them same checks for this. So I'll just create them here. So we need to do an if statement. And it was the content type of the server global variable. So it's content underscore type, and I need to check to make sure it is application /JSON data. Yep, so that's checking. If it's not application JSON, then we're going to send a error response out. So what I'm going to do is just save a bit of time, copy and paste this one because it is very similar. So we'll create the new error response. It's a 400 error because the client hasn't sent the right type of data. Success is false, and we're going to send a message back. So content type header not set to JSON. Okay, so that's the first check done. The next thing we need to do is to get the contents or the JSON data that's been passed in through the body. So we need to get the raw data. So raw patch data this time, and it was file get contents, remember, and we're using the PHP input method. So that should get the contents of the data that's been passed in. Save it in the variable, so we're going to do some checks on it. First check we need to do is to make sure that it is JSON data that's been passed in. Now the way we do that, we'll try and decode it as JSON, and if it can't decode it as JSON, we get a false response back. So we need to check that. So we need to check, and if we do get a response, we'll save it in this variable as JSON data. So JSON data equals JSON decode, and it was raw patch data. Oops. So we'll try and decode it as JSON, so that raw patch data from up here, which has been passed in through the body, and you'll see when we tested at the end using Postman, we sort of generate the JSON data for the data that we want to update on the task. We'll save it in a variable, and if this can't decode it as JSON, it returns false, so we make sure that it is not false. So if it is false, we send a response error back. So I'll just copy this, and it's a 400, yeah, because it's still a client issue. Success is false, and we'll just change the error message that gets sent back. Request body is not valid. Oops. JSON. Okay, so that's our second check in place. I'll just scroll this down slightly. So now we need to keep track of which fields are being asked to be updated. So what we'll do here is just create 4 variables that we can keep track of what is actually being updated. So the first one is title updated, and we'll just initially set all these to false, and we'll set them to true where it is the case. So title updated is false. Description updated equals false, and then it was deadline updated equals false, just so we can keep track of, you know, what is being updated. Completed updated, oops, equals false. Oops, another typo. Okay, so now we've got the fields that can potentially be updated for the task. Obviously we can't update an ID, so we don't try and update that. But we can update a title, a description, a deadline, and the completed status. So we're just keeping track of what has been updated. Okay, so what we're going to do here is use the update statement, the SQL statement for update. But what we need to do is build this query dynamically, because we only want to update the fields that's been provided and just leave the fields that haven't been provided at their current values. So what we need to do here is dynamically build the query up, and as I go through this you'll understand. So we just need to create an empty string at the moment, and then we're going to be appending the query as we go. So if we create query fields, and we'll just create a blank string at the moment. Okay, so we need to check to see which fields have been passed in the JSON data. Then we need to update these to true if it exists, otherwise it just will be left false. And then what we need to do is append the dynamic SQL query to this string here, so it builds it up as we go through each field. So the way we do that is an if statement, and we need to check that it is set within the JSON data. Now we'll use the decoded JSON data here, and if you remember from our creation of tasks, we can just access it like an object variable. So we can use JSON data, and then we'll look for the title. I'll just create that there just so you can see it. So we're firstly saying that try and access the title from the passed in JSON data. If it exists, so that's the is set, then what we'll do is set the title updated to true. So we can keep check of what has been passed in to update. But now what we'll also do is append to the query field. So, query fields, and then how we append is dot equals. So the dot and equals keeps what's currently in there. So if this said test, it would currently keep test and then whatever we set after that. But at the minute, we just need to get rid of that. So, like I say, this is SQL data that we, or a SQL statement that we're sort of building up here. So it's SQL that we're adding in here. So it'll be title equals, and then because we're using PDO, we're using placeholders. This will all come together towards the end of this video as we go through these, but we're building up what needs updating using the SQL statement. So what we're going to do is run through each of these fields and do exactly the same. So on to the next one. So if is set, and then JSON data, and then this time, it was description. Can't spell. Description, and then it would be description updated equals true, and then it'll be query fields dot equals, and that would be description. Actually, I forgot something there. That's just reminded us. So because we're building this up dynamically, the SQL statement between each field that you want to update, there's usually a comma. So in this, what we're going to do is title, and then the value of title, which is a placeholder at the moment, and then we're just going to put a comma, because ideally I'll just explain it here. So we'll do update TBL tasks set title equals title description equals description, can't spell, description, I'll just do that for the time being, but where ID equals task ID. So that's very much similar what we're actually building up dynamically here. So where we're doing the set is this bit here. So you can see that bit there is actually this bit here. And description will be this bit here. So we'll need description and then description with a comma after it. And then we'll build this up as we go. So I'll just get rid of that. Just thought I would explain actually what we're doing here. So I'll just spell this correctly. Description equals description. Don't forget the comma and the space. And then the next one would be the deadline. So if is set JSON data deadline updated equals true, and then query fields dot equals, and it would be actually this one's slightly different because we need to format the date in this one. So going back to the creation of a task, we'll use the same sort of format. So first of all, it is deadline equals, because that's the SQL part of it. And then the SQL statement is string to date. And then it was the placeholder, so that was deadline. And then it was a mask. So that would be %d slash %m slash %Y space %H colon %I, and then semicolon. Yep, that looks right. So day, month, year, hour, minute. Yeah, that's fine. So after that, don't forget we need the comma and then a space. So that's deadline. So the last one is completed. Yeah. So if is set JSON data completed. Oops. So completed updated equals true, and query fields dot equals, and then it is completed equals completed comma space. Don't forget a semicolon. Okay, so that should build our set part up for the query. So title, description, deadline. Obviously deadline slightly different because we're formatting a date, because we're storing it as a date. And then completed is completed. Now it could be a combination of these things, because you might say, well, I'm going to update the title, but I'm not going to update the description. I'm not going to update the deadline, but I'm going to update the completed status. So it would just be title and the completed status. Now when you SQL query, on the last value that you put in, obviously you don't have the comma. It's just then obviously any conditions after that. So what we need to do is, because we have the comma on every one, if we just look at the string, the query field string, and just remove the last comma, then that should allow us to have a valid query. So the way we do that is query fields, and then we need to equals, and we're going to use the right trim here, so our trim, and then we pass in our initial query fields, and then what we want to do is remove the last comma and space. So what we would have here is update TBL task set title equals title where task where ID equals task ID. So if we didn't do this here, this is what the SQL statement would be. So we update TBL task set title tasks. I'm not using that, I don't know why I corrected that, but so I've set title and then title equals the placeholder. But you can see here we've still got the comma here. Now at the moment that is not a valid SQL statement, and what you could do is then have description, but see again we would still have the comma, which is not valid. So what we do is, it doesn't matter which field is provided, we always strip off that last comma. So there you go. So now that would be a valid statement. So that's just an explanation of why we do an R trim and then trim off the last comma on there. Let's get rid of that again because we don't need that. Okay, so since we've done that, we need to check to make sure there has been some data provided. Otherwise, we can't update anything. So as a bit of a general check, we'll just make sure that these are not all set to false, because if they're all set to false, then we haven't updated anything. So we need to sort of throw an error message out or a standard error response out. So I'll just scroll down, just make some space again, and we'll do an if statement, because we're just going to do a check to run through these updated, oops, I've gone a bit far, updated variables, just to make sure that there is one of them at least true. So if title updated is false, and then we'll do and description updated equals false, and deadline updated equals false, and completed updated equals false. So we're saying if the title's false, or the title updated, sorry, is false, and the description updated is false, and the deadline's updated false and the completed is updated equals false, then we haven't provided anything, because this checks to make sure that something has been provided, and if it has, it sets it to true. So that's the check. Just at the end of that, we'll just do our if statement. So this is the error, so we need to create a response. So we'll just copy this response to save us a bit of time. So it's new response. It's a 400 error because we haven't provided any fields to update, so it's a client issue. And we'll just change the error here. So no task fields provided. I think that's good enough for that. So just scroll down again. So now that we've got, or in theory, got some valid data, what we need to do is retrieve the existing task using the task ID that's passed in via task / say task ID 7. So we need to retrieve that task to then update it. So what we'll do is, because what we don't want to do is to just update a task without calling it back. Now mine's fairly simple here because I call the task back. It's then stored in the task model that we created, which does our validation and things like that. But what you might want to do is every time a task's updated, maybe increment the amount of times it's been updated or something like that. Now, in order to know what that value is, you have to retrieve the task initially to then update it. So I don't necessarily have to do it in this case, but I think it's good practice to retrieve the task, have that as a task object in PHP, and then call your setters and getters on that, and that still provides the validation for the data. So what we're going to do here is create the database query to do that. And I guess because we're updating here, we want to query this against the right DB, so the master DB, because the last thing we want is just, pulled back an old version of a task and then updated that and overwrote any old or any new data, I should say. So we'll actually run this against the right DB, even though it's just a read query at the moment. So query equals, and then it was right DB, and then it was prepare. So we'll just call that task back or retrieve that row. So select ID, title, description, and then it was date format, and then it was deadline. Remember, we'll bring the back in a certain way. Oops. And then it was %, %d, %m, %Y, and then %h, colon, %I. And then alias it as deadline. And then we want to bring back completed from tbl tasks where ID equals, and then we'll pass in obviously task ID. So that's a SQL query. We've done this before to retrieve a single task. We're actually passing in a task ID. Let's go back, and then we want to bind the parameter. So query bind param, and it was task ID because that's what we've been passed in. Oops. And if you remember, if I scroll all the way back up, because I haven't written this bit yet, but as part of the check for the root, we get task ID and we store it in a task ID, so we can make use of that here. So if I scroll back down, so if I do task ID, and then it is of type PDO param int, because it's an integer. So now that we've got that, we can execute it. Oops. Execute. Okay, so in theory, if the passed in task ID is valid, it should bring back a row. So if that task ID doesn't exist, there won't be a row to bring back. So that's what we need to check now. So we need to get a row count. Row count equals query, and then the function row count. And then we need to do a check on that row count to make sure it's not 0. So row count, if it is 0, then we are going to return a response, an error response. So we'll copy that one, paste it in there. I mean, you can type it out, but we've written this massive amount of times now during this course, so it's the same sort of standard stuff here. So we're going to change this to a 404 error, because 404 is not found, remember. So technically, I guess it could be a client error, but it makes more sense to return a 404 error because the client probably doesn't really know how many or which task IDs are existent, because some might have been deleted. So I think it makes perfect sense to send back a 404 not found error. So it's false, and then we need to change this to say no task found to update, because we can't find the task, so we can't update it. So that's the first check. So scroll down to see where we're going. However, if there is a row, then we will return that and store that, or try and create a new task model and store the details in there. So the way we do that is the while statement, if you remember, and then we'll save that row in the row variable, and then query, and we use the fetch, and then it is PDO, and then it was fetch associate of array. And then we'll try and create a new task here. So task, yep, so task equals new, oops, task. And then we'll pass in the rows. So row for the ID, and it was row completed, no it wasn't, it was title, row description, row deadline, row completed. Okay, so we've got that now. So this should help create a task. We'll pass in the values retrieved from the database. So the ID, the title, description, the deadline, and the completed status. We'll save that in task. Now what we want to do, I guess if it has a bit trouble creating a task here, if it hasn't got any valid data in now, you know, people mess about with the back end of the database rather than going through the front end of the API, as in internal people. They could have corrupted some data or something like that. So potentially that task could fail. And obviously you've got our task exception down here to handle that. However, if everything's gone in via the API, it still has to go through the same validation. So in theory, it shouldn't fail. It should have failed before the task got put in there. So hopefully that shouldn't fail, but if it does, we've got the response there to handle that. So now what we need to do, we've got the task. We need to create the query that will be used to update that task in the database. So we're going to build this up as we go. We'll create the query string, and then what we'll do, we'll bind the parameters for that update query from the values we get from this task. So we've got the task, that's the original data at this point. We'll then go through our JSON data from the values that's been updated. We'll attempt to update this task object. If it's successful, that's great. And then what we'll do is we'll then do our update statement and bind the parameters from what we've stored in the new task. So what we need to do first is create the query string for the update. So query string, because we're going to dynamically build this, and the query fields is obviously part of this whole query string. So query string, it was update TBL tasks, and then what we want to do is set with a space, and then what we're going to do is append the query fields in the middle of that, and then space where ID equals task ID. Yep, that looks fine. So creating the query string, we're appending the fields in the middle of this, and then we're saying where the ID is the task ID. So this is the start of the update statement. What we'll then do here is prepare this. So and we'll do this against the write DB because we're now updating stuff, so it needs to be done against the master. So the query, yeah, that's fine because that's a query string. We're going to pass this in. So the query equals write DB, and then it's prepare. And instead of putting the SQL statement in here, I've just broke it down. So we're just going to put this variable in here, query string. So we've prepared at this point, and now what we're going to do is cycle through, scroll up, and we're just going to cycle through these, and where they're true, we're just going to set the task. So if I scroll down, the task we created here, where it's true at the top, we're going to set the value of the task variable. So it could be title, description, that sort of thing. And then what we're going to do is retrieve that back out because we want to make sure that it has been successful. And in your task model, you might do some formatting or something like that. We don't know. We don't in this one. The only thing that we do some formatting on is the date. But it depends on what you're doing. So it's good practice to use the task object to set something, and then you get it back from that before you then update the row in the database, because then it can do validation and that sort of stuff. So you'll see a bit clearer as we do this here. So we need to check to see if the title's been updated. So title updated equals true. So if it has, we need to update the task. So task set title, and then we'll pass in this title from the JSON data. Remember, because that's how we're getting the values. So the JSON data, and then if we just use title, so we'll try and set the title of the retrieved task. So we could be overwriting it here. That's fine. This data will be validated because we're using the setters and getters from the task. So that's good. So there's the validation. That can obviously throw a task exception, which is then handled here. And don't forget, we've got our custom error message to say what has gone wrong with the data. So we're in good shape here. So set the title, and then what we want to do is retrieve that title back out. Like I say, you could have formatted it, or you could have done some processing internally with that. You should never update the database directly with the sort of the data that's passed in. You should always do some checking on it. So what I'm going to do here is just create a new variable called basically updated title, just so we can tell the difference between the title and the updated title. And we'll call task get title. Like I say, I know this sounds a bit daft to sort of set it and then get it, but you know, we might be doing some processing in there. So now what we've got is the updated title value, and now what we'll do is bind this to the query. So if we do query, and then it was bind param, and then the parameter, don't forget, was title, and then we're passing in not this title, don't forget, we're passing in the updated title, the retrieved title. So up title. So you're probably thinking, well, where's this came from? But if we go up to our dynamically created query, you can see here the placeholder is title. So the next one will be description, and then obviously our deadline, but we're formatting that first, and then the completed status. Scroll back down. So that's the first one there. Now what we're going to do is exactly the same for the description, the deadline, the completed status. So if we just do the same, oops. So description updated, if that's true, then we're still working on the same task here. So task set description, and then we'll pass in the JSON data description, and then we'll get the updated description. Yep, so up description, get description, that's fine, yeah. And then what we'll do is bind the parameter. So query bind param, and that was description, and then it was the updated description, and then it was type. Actually, I forgot to do that up here, haven't I? So I forgot to give it a type. So the type was PDO, and then param, and it's a string. PDO param, and it's a string. Yeah, just double check. So we've passed that in, we've done that. Yeah, the updated description. Okay, so the next one. So if deadline updated equals true, then task set deadline, and it was JSON data deadline, and then updated deadline equals task get deadline, and then query bind param, and it was deadline, and we'll pass in the updated deadline, and that is that's a string as well. Even though it's a date, we're passing it as a string. PDO param string. Okay, I'll just scroll down a bit. The last one is completed status. So if completed updated equals true, we'll just run through this again. So set completed, just make sure I'm not making any typos here really. Set completed JSON data completed, up completed, and then it was task get completed, and then bind that to the query bind param completed, and then it was the updated completed PDO param string. Okay, so we're building up the query as we go here. So we've got all of the data there. The last thing we need to do here, yeah, is to just go back up, is to bind the task ID, because we haven't done that yet. We've put the placeholder in there here, but we haven't bound that parameter yet. So the way we do that, we've obviously done this exactly the same as just up here, bind param. So query, but this task ID is not based on any of the other fields, so this is why that would do it outside of these if statements. So bind param task ID, oops, and that was task ID, and that was PDO param, and it's an integer because it's a number. Okay, so now we need to try and execute it. So query, and then execute. Let's get rid of that space there. So we'll bind the task ID, we'll try and execute the query, and then we see if it has successfully updated the row. And the way that would do that, because we're running an update SQL statement, the row count should be the amount of rows that's been affected by this statement. But because we're passing in a unique task ID, it should be 1. And if it's not 1, then there's been an error. So we need obviously handle that. So get the row count. So query row count, and then we need to do the check on that. So if row count is 0, chuck out an error response. So I'm just going to copy this, paste that in there, success is false, and then we'll just pass in an error message. Task not updated. I think that's enough, yeah, task not updated. Okay, so at this point, the task should have now been updated in the database if everything went right. Now, what we could do is just return the task object, so this object here that we've done our amendments on, so we've updated them and things like that. It's not really that good to do that because we might say, well, we've changed that to, you know, a value, but actually the value in the database is still an old value. We always want to return the value from the database. Now, it shouldn't be, but it's just to make things consistent. So what we need to do now that we've updated that row in the database, we need to retrieve that row. So going back to the top, we got that row out of the database initially. Just scroll down. So we've got that out there initially. We've saved that as a task object. We've then done our updates to that task object. And then we have updated that back into the database. So what we want to do now is to retrieve that line or that row out of the database to make sure that we've got all the right values and return that to the client. Now, every time you update an object, you should always return the updated object back to the client, so they know that the details are right and they've got the latest version of that row, basically, or that object. So because we've just updated it and because this is all running, you know, sequentially after each other, we should retrieve this based on the write DB. We need the master DB, because if we try and query it against the read DBs, it may not have populated or, you know, pushed out to them yet. So because we've updated something, we need to retrieve the updated one from the write master DB. So just like previously, we'll create a new query, which will just bring back the row from the database. So we'll prepare that, and it was select ID, title, description, deadline, completed. Don't forget deadline, we need to format that. So it was date format, and then it was deadline followed by the mask. So that was %d, %m, %y, and then it was %h colon %i. And then we need alias as deadline, and then if we go back to here, completed from tbl tasks, whoops, spelled it wrong, where id equals and task id. Don't forget that. Okay, so now what we need to do is bind the task ID parameter. So query bind param, and it was called task ID, and the variable was called task ID, and it was of type PDO param integer. And then we just need to execute it. I'll just get rid of that. Yep, query all. And then it was, so this is retrieving the new row, or the updated row I should say, from the database, hopefully. Check a row count, because there always should be one row here because we've just updated it. So row count, query row count, yeah. Oops, spelled that wrong there. Okay. And then we'll do a check to make sure the row count is not 0, I guess. Row count. So if it is 0, then we'll just copy that. And it's a 404 error because the row doesn't exist. And we'll return no task found after update. Now in theory we should never get to this point, but it's good putting the check in there and then just give a bit of information about what's gone wrong or which stage it's gone wrong. Scroll down. So hopefully we should have a row count of 1 now, and we need to create the tasks array, task array, to store this in to then return back to the client. So blank array, and then we'll do our while, while, and then row equals, and it was query fetch, and then it was it PDO fetch associate of array. Yeah, that's fine. And then we need to create a new task, don't we? So task, new task, and then pass in the row values. So row description, row deadline, row completed. So we've got the task, that's fine. So then we'll add this task to the tasks array so we can return it. So task array, and then append, and then task. No, that's wrong, because we need to return task as array. Yeah, don't forget to do that, that's important. So we've got the while, yep. And then we just need to send the response back to the client. So we'll build the return data up like we've done in previous lessons. So return data, we'll create an array for that because that's what it is. And then return data, rows returned, and that was row count. And then return data, and then it was tasks, and then this is the tasks, oh sorry, the task array, not tasks. Yeah, that's fine. And then we'll create our, I'll just scroll down, we'll create our success response. So response equals new response, then it's response set HTTP status code, and at this point it's 200 because we have successfully updated a task, so it's an OK. And then it is response set success, it's true, which is good. We don't write many of these ones, we do mainly error checking, but hey, and then response, and then we'll add a message, and we'll just say task updated. Oops, I think that's fine. And then we need to add the data, so because obviously we need to return the newly updated row or task, I should say. So add data, set data, sorry, and then that is the return data, and then we'll send it, and then exit. Okay, so I'll just get rid of this white space, save that. So hopefully we'll test this in a second. Like I say, this was pretty complicated, this one. It's something out of the ordinary because we're retrieving, we're updating, and then we're retrieving again from the database. So there's a lot more code and logic in this one really. But hopefully as we've built it up, you can see that we've done the checks and we've set the values where needed and created the dynamic update SQL for the fields. So hopefully when we test this now, it should work. So make sure MAMP's running, for an open up Postman. And what I'm going to do to begin with, I'm just going to make this bigger. I'm going to run a GET request for task ID 1, because I think we've still got that in the database. HTTP localhost port 8888 version 1 / tasks /1. Now it's a GET request, so it should Oops, I've got a syntax error. So we'll just go and double check that. So that is on line 161. So we'll go back to our Atom. We'll scroll up to line 161. I probably just forgot a semicolon or something like that. Query fields, yep, semicolon, there you go. I knew I'd forgot that. So save that, and we'll go back to Postman, hopefully. Send, oh, we've got another error, line 246. Let's quickly diagnose that. Scroll down to 246. So that's over here. Let's double check here. Oh yes, I haven't put the SQL statement in single quotes, so forgive me for that. And then single quote at the end. Save that. Yep, because the SQL query should be in quotes. Okay, hopefully this time. So send that. Okay, so we haven't got a task ID of 1, so we'll try 2. Right, so we can see that we do have a task ID of 2. So we'll try and update this one. So currently the title says task 2 and description 2 and completed of no. We'll change this to new task 2, new description 2, and we'll change the completed to Y. So I'm just going to create a new request here because I want to go back to this one shortly. We're going to create a patch request, remember, because we're doing an update. So what we're going to do here is localhost port version 1 task/2 because it's task 2 that we'll want to update. So now that we've got that, we need to go to our body because we need to provide the fields that we want to update. Now if I just submit this, you can see there that our content type header has not been set to JSON. Okay, so that bit of the logic's working. So if we change that to raw and we change that to type of JSON, you can see that it's then created our header of content type application JSON. So now if I rerun this, you can see now we get a different error message. Request body is not valid JSON. It's because we haven't provided any. So that error disappeared for the content type for the header. And then if we provide just an empty JSON string in the body here, and then submit that, you can see here that we get an error message, no task fields provided. So the logic's working there that actually if we don't provide anything, it can't update anything. So we'll provide title, and we were going to call that new title 2. We were also going to provide a new description, so description, and then we were going to call that new description 2. And we're also going to complete the task itself. So the way that you do that is completed, and then we'll set that to a Y. So provided the title, the description, and the completed status. And if I quickly go back to our original GET request here, these were the values, task 2, description 2, and completed no. So now if we run this patch request, let's scroll up, you can see it says it's a 200, its success is true, the task has been updated, and then it returns the task itself. So obviously the data rows returned is 1, and then tasks, which is just an array of 1 task at the moment. So you can see here task ID 2, it's got a new title, it's got a new description, and the completed status is now Y. So that's been updated and returned back to the client. Now if we go back and get another GET request for that same task, remember this is the old values here, we'll just refresh that. You can see here that that task has now been updated. So new title, new description, and the completed is Y. So we could have provided a title, description, the deadline, and completed, or we could have just provided a title to update. It would still work. So what I'm going to do here, we're going to update task 2 again, but I'm going to set it back to completed no. I'm not going to update the title or anything, I'm just going to leave that. So I'm going to set the completed to no and send that. So you can see there the task has been updated, new title, new description. Remember that's what was set on the previous update, not this one. but the completed status is back to no, which is correct. So we'll go back to the normal get request just to retrieve. Completed still Y because we need to refresh it. So if we go to send, the completed still no. So now that that bit's working, we'll just go back to Adam. This is our API completed now. And the next part, we will be implementing the token-based authentication and giving it a bit of a theory lesson on that first before we update these scripts to take advantage of that.